It was a cold evening on September 13th, 2022, when 17-year-old Samantha Torres walked out of Westridge High School for the last time. She had no idea that by the time the clock struck midnight, her world would come to a tragic and violent end. Just hours earlier, Samantha had been laughing with her friends, making plans for the weekend. She had no reason to suspect that someone who had been in her life every day, someone she thought she could trust, would turn her life into a nightmare. How could Hector Ramirez, the school janitor, a man she barely knew beyond casual greetings in the hallways, be the one to take her life? What drove him to commit such a shocking crime against a young woman with a bright future ahead of her? Was it a moment of weakness, or something far darker brewing beneath the surface? And what was the truth that Samantha had unknowingly uncovered, something that would ultimately cost her everything? Welcome to True Crime Vault, your go-to source for captivating crime stories, unsolved mysteries, and gripping investigations. A huge thank you to my amazing viewers and subscribers for your support. Keep tuning in for daily updates on true crime tales, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay updated. Samantha had always been the girl with dreams. She worked hard in school, excelling in her studies, and planning to leave her small town behind to make something of herself. But one night, everything changed. She crossed paths with Hector, an older man who had worked at the school for years, cleaning classrooms and hallways, a quiet figure in the background of her life. But Hector had his own secrets. Behind his unassuming exterior was a man who had been hiding something dark and dangerous, something that would soon collide with Samantha's fate in a way no one could have ever imagined. Samantha Torres was like many young women her age, hopeful, ambitious, and eager to make something of herself. A senior at Westridge High School. She was smart, driven, and dedicated to her studies, but she also carried the weight of family struggles at home. Her parents had divorced years ago, and she'd been left to pick up the pieces, shouldering more responsibility than any teenager should have to. Samantha's dream was to go to college, to escape, and to build a life that was hers and hers alone. She was beginning to see a future outside the confines of Westridge, a future that seemed almost within reach. But all of that came crashing down when Hector Ramirez entered her life in a way she never expected. Hector Ramirez was a man of few words. He spent his days cleaning the classrooms and hallways of Westridge High School, unnoticed by most students and teachers. A tall, stocky figure, Hector blended into the background, his presence barely acknowledged. But beneath that unassuming exterior was a man with deep-seated frustration and a simmering sense of powerlessness. Hector had always struggled with relationships, plagued by a string of failed marriages and strained connections with those around him. But it wasn't just that. There was something darker in his past, something that had festered for years, an obsession with a particular student, Samantha Torres. He'd been watching her for months, noticing how she seemed to have everything he'd never had, a future, hope, and the kind of life he'd never been able to create for himself. Hector's fixation on Samantha began innocently enough, just casual glances and moments when he'd find himself looking at her during his nightly cleaning shifts. But over time, his thought became more intrusive, more possessive. He couldn't shake the feeling that Samantha, with her beauty and ambition, was somehow out of reach, a symbol of everything he wanted but couldn't have. And as his obsession deepened, it blurred the line between admiration and something far more sinister. Samantha and Hector had spoken many times before. He was a janitor, and she was a student. Polite exchanges in the hallway, small talk during late hours when she stayed after school to finish her work. But this time was different. Hector had been watching her more intently, his conversations lingering longer than usual. At first, Samantha didn't think much of it. He was always quiet. After all, just an older man going through the motions of his day. But something about his eyes started to unsettle her, a quiet intensity that she couldn't shake. His questions were becoming increasingly personal, too familiar for someone she barely knew. His comments about her life seemed to cross a line, veering into territory she didn't want to discuss. One evening, as she stayed late in the library, finishing a project, Hector found her alone. He didn't ask if she needed help, didn't offer the usual pleasantries. Instead, he lingered in the doorway, watching her as if he had all the time in the world. Samantha felt the shift in his demeanor before he spoke, a coldness settling over him that sent a chill crawling down her spine. She tried to brush it off, But when Hector stepped closer, his breath heavy with something unspoken, she realized she had made a mistake by staying late. Samantha didn't know how it happened. One moment, they were talking. Well, she was trying to make conversation, to ease attention. But the next, everything shifted. Hector's grip was on her arm, pulling her towards the exit, his words slurring with urgency. "Come with me," he muttered, his voice hoarse. Samantha pulled back, her heart pounding in her chest. "Hector, what's going on?" she asked, trying to pull her arm free, but his fingers tightened. She could feel the fear rising in her throat. Before she knew it, she was in the back of his van, parked behind the school in a shadowed corner. The doors slammed shut, and suddenly the world outside felt miles away. Hector's face was inches from haze, his eyes wide with something she couldn't recognize, something darker. Her heart raced as she pushed against his chest, her breaths coming faster, panicked. "Let me go. Hector, this isn't funny." But his gaze never wavered, and she could feel the cold metal of his resolve. In the confined space of the van, with the windows rolled up, the air grew suffocating. Hector's hands found her throat before she could even scream. Samantha gasped for air, her vision blurring as she struggled to free herself. But Hector wasn't letting go. His fingers tightened with a strength she didn't know he possessed, his grip unyielding as the seconds dragged on. Samantha's hands clawed at his wrists, her body jerking with desperation, but the fight drained from her. Her breaths were shallow, her chest tightening as the darkness closed in around her. Hector's face remained expressionless, his eyes distant as if he was somewhere else entirely. Samantha's vision went black, and then nothing. The investigation began almost immediately after Samantha was reported missing. Her parents had grown frantic, the small town's tight-knit community now torn apart by the disappearance of a young girl who had been full of potential. The police were quick to arrive at the school, conducting interviews and gathering the sparse details of her last known whereabouts. But as days passed, the hope of finding her alive began to fade. Detectives Claudia Moreno and Ben Marshall, seasoned investigators with years of experience, were assigned to the case. As they reviewed the surveillance footage from the school's security cameras, they noticed something unsettling. Hector Ramirez had been around the area the night Samantha disappeared, lingering in the background, just outside the camera's line of sight. It was suspicious. A janitor, who usually stayed out of the way, now seemed to be everywhere Samantha had been. His odd behavior, his uncomfortable conversations with her, everything pointed to him. Yet, when they questioned him, Hector's answers were evasive, his demeanor off. His alibi was shaky at best, and that's when the detectives knew they had to dig deeper. The next step was a search. Hector had made a slip during one of the interviews, mentioning that he had taken care of the problem after Samantha had tried to run. The detectives immediately focused on the area Hector had hinted at, a secluded patch of wood behind the school, where he had said he buried her. The search teams, armed with flashlights and metal detectors, combed the dense brush as attention hung heavy in the air. Hours passed, the ground growing colder and the trees looming darker as the search continued. Just as the team was starting to feel the weight of hopelessness, one of the officers called out, "I've got something." The excitement in the air was intense, but the realization of what they had uncovered was devastating. The ground had been disturbed, uneven, shallow, a makeshift grave. As the officers worked together to pull away the loose dirt and branches, the unmistakable shape of a body slowly came into view. Wrapped tightly in a sheet, the form of Samantha Torres was unearthed. Her once vibrant face was pale, her eyes closed forever, as if frozen in time. She was gone, and the brutal truth of what had happened to her finally began to surface. The investigators exchanged solemn looks. This wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. It was a murder investigation, and Hector Ramirez was a prime suspect. The following day, Hector was brought into the interrogation room. His hands were trembling as he sat across from Detectives Moreno and Marshall. They exchanged a knowing look before Moreno spoke, her voice calm but firm. "Hector, we know what happened that night. We know where you buried her." Hector swallowed hard, his face ashen. His eyes darted to the table, avoiding the piercing gaze of the detectives. The silence stretched out between them. I didn't mean to hurt her." Hector's voice cracked, barely audible. He looked up at them, his eyes wild with panic. "I just wanted to know the truth." I needed to know if she was going to ruin everything for me. I didn't want her to tell anyone what we'd done. She wouldn't stop asking questions. So I... His words trailed off, his breath hitching in his chest as he struggled to hold back tears. But Detective Marshall wasn't buying it. He leaned forward, his voice steely and cold. You strangled her. Hector. You took her life because she knew too much. You were willing to go to any lengths to keep your secret. Hector's hand shook violently, his face contorting with guilt and regret as he nodded, the horror of his own actions finally setting in. I didn't know what to do, Hector whispered, his head drooping. I thought maybe if I just hid her, everything would be okay. But the detectives weren't moved by his pitiful excuse. The crime he had committed was anything but a momentary lapse in judgment. It was cold, calculated, and irreversible. The courtroom was packed. The air was thick with tension as reporters whispered among themselves, their pens scribbling every detail of the trial that had shaken the town. The once quiet community of Westridge had been forever altered by the brutal murder of Samantha Torres, and now the man responsible for her death sat before a judge, waiting for his fate to be sealed. Hector Ramirez, the school janitor turned murderer, sat motionless at the defendant's table. His face was gaunt, his once stocky frame now slumped as if the weight of his crimes had physically crushed him. Shackles bound his hands together, the dull metal reflecting the cold, unforgiving light of the courtroom. He didn't raise his head. He didn't look at anyone. There was no fight left in him. As the judge entered, the murmurs died down. The jury had deliberated for hours, but in truth, the evidence had been overwhelming. The surveillance footage, the confession, the discovery of Samantha's body, all of it painted a clear, horrific picture. There were no unanswered questions, no room for doubt. The only thing left was a final judgment. All rise, the bailiff called, his voice ringing through the silent courtroom. Hector stiffened as the judge spoke, his voice unwavering. In the case of the state versus Hector Ramirez, on the charge of second-degree murder, how does a defendant plead? Hector's voice was barely above a whisper. Guilty, Your Honor. The words echoed, final and damning. There was no trial, no attempt at a defense. He knew what he had done. He knew what he deserved. The judge continued, his tone measured yet firm. Given the severity of this crime, and after reviewing the evidence, this court sentences Hector Ramirez to life in prison without the possibility of parole. A gasp rippled through the gallery. Samantha's family clutched one another, their grief a silent storm that had been raging since the day she disappeared. The sentence was harsh, but no punishment could ever undo what had been done. Then, the moment that had been anticipated, the opportunity for Samantha's loved ones to speak. The bailiff called forward Maria Torres, Samantha's mother. Maria stepped up, her hands trembling as she clutched a framed photograph of her daughter. Samantha, forever 17. Her bright smile, frozen in time. Maria's lips parted, but for a moment, no words came. Just the weight of her loss, pressing down on her shoulders, suffocating. She took a deep breath and faced Hector, her voice raw with grief. You stole my daughter's life, she said, each word laced with unbearable pain. She had dreams. She was going to go to college, travel, have a family. But now, she will never walk across the stage at graduation. She will never see another birthday. She will never come home again. Hector stared at the floor. He couldn't look at her. Maria's voice wavered, but did not break. And for what? Because she wouldn't give you what you wanted? Because you thought you had the right to take everything from her? You are a coward. A selfish, disgusting coward. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she wiped it away, her grief replaced by quiet fury. You get to live. You get to breathe. But my daughter is gone. The courtroom was silent. Not a single sound, except for Maria's broken breath as she stepped back. The judge gave Hector one last look before speaking. Mr. Ramirez, you not only took an innocent life, but you also shattered a family. You have shown no remorse, and this court sees no reason to grant you any mercy. May you spend the rest of your days behind bars, knowing the life you stole and the pain you have caused. With a final bang of the gavel, it was over. Hector Ramirez was let out of the courtroom, his head low, his shoulders slumped. He didn't fight. He didn't protest. There was nothing left to say. His fate had been sealed the moment he wrapped his hands around Samantha Torres' throat. But no sentence, no number of years in a prison cell, could bring her back. Samantha Torres should have had her whole life ahead of her. She should have graduated, traveled, fallen in love, built the future she had dreamed of. But instead, her story ended in the back of a van, in the hands of a man who believed he had a right to control her fate. Her family will never see her walk across the stage at graduation. Her friends will never hear her laugh again. The world lost a bright, promising young woman. Not to illness, not to accident, but to the twisted obsession of someone who should have never been in her life to begin with. Hector Ramirez will spend the rest of his days behind bars. But for Samantha's family, there is no parole. There is no release from the grief of waking up every day in a world where she no longer exists. The true tragedy is not just that her life was taken, it's that it was taken so senselessly. What drives someone to kill in a moment of obsession? When does admiration become something far darker? And how do we stop tragedies like this before they happen? What do you think led Hector to take Samantha's life? Was this a crime of impulse, or was it something planned all along? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another true crime story. Because sometimes the truth is buried, but it always finds its way to the surface.